I'm Bonnie Weddle. I'm the coordinator of the Electronic Records Unit at the New York State Archives and the co-chair of the COSA State Electronic Records Initiative's Education and Programming Subcommittee. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, which focuses on the National Digital Stewardship Alliance's recently updated version of Levels of Preservation. Today's webinar is part of COSA's Spring 2020 slate of State Electronic Records Initiative webinars. Next month, we'll hear about how West Virginia University has handled electronic constituent correspondence extracted from multiple proprietary systems and dealt with privacy and other concerns associated with these records. In April, 3 digital archivists will highlight tools and strategies for documenting digital records workflows and discuss how those of us who do hands-on electronic records work can make sure that our colleagues and successors can retrace our footsteps. The May and June webinars are still under development, but I can tell you that the May webinar will, in conjunction with May Day, focus on electronic records disaster preparedness and recovery, and that our June offering will concern the State Electronic Records Initiative itself. In addition, we're going to have a bonus webinar this spring. In response to significant demand, Cal Lee is going to do an encore presentation of BitCurator for State Archives, which was one of last year's best attended webinars. At the moment, we're not quite sure whether this webinar is going to take place in May or June, so stay tuned. We will have a definitive date by the time the March webinar rolls around. I'd also like to draw your attention to a couple of video resources that SERI has developed. Managing Digital Content is a video series that discusses the core activities associated with digital preservation, being identifying the content that you have or will have, selection of content that warrants preservation, storing content appropriately, protecting it from inadvertent or deliberate loss or alteration, managing over time, and providing access to it. These videos are modular, self-paced, and always available. They're a great resource for people who are new to your organization or to the topic of digital preservation. At the moment, our good friends at the Utah State Archives is hosting them, but they will move over to COSA's YouTube channel shortly. FAQs on BitRot is on COSA's YouTube channel, and it's a short, non-technical overview of what BitRot is and how to reduce the risk that it will affect your records. It's suitable not only for archive staff, but for agency records creators as well. Please be on the lookout for more videos in 2020. We're currently putting the finishing touches on the first of a year-long slate of videos. More videos are in the pipeline. And now for the matter at hand. Levels of Preservation version 2.0. Today's presenters, Nancy McGovern, Dan Noonan, and Carol Kussman, were all involved in the 2019 reboot of the National Digital Stewardship Alliance's Levels of Digital Preservation. Nancy and Dan were part of the revision subgroup that worked to update the Levels of Digital Preservation matrix, and Carol was a member of the assessment subgroup. You can see their institutional affiliations on their screen, and contact information for all of them will appear at the end of this webinar. I am now going to turn the floor over to Nancy. Please note that we will hold all questions until the end. However, please feel free to enter any questions you may have into the chat box at the right of your screen at any time during the presentation. Okay, Nancy, take it away.
Thank you. I even unmuted myself successfully, I think.
Yes.
All right. Today we're talking to you about the NDSA Levels of Digital Preservation. It has been, I think, the people on our subgroup, Dan and I, it was a really productive and very rewarding experience, and hopefully that comes through in talking about it today. I get to talk about purpose and history. That suits me fine. One of the things that we get asked, we did a workshop at iPress 2019 in the fall, and one of the questions that people have is why the levels, where do they come from? So this is just a bit of context on that. Those of us, sorry, I can see that it sounds a little garbled. I'll try to get closer, but is that better? I'll just carry on. All right. Since 1996, when Preserving Digital Information came out, the seminal report, we have been working on across the digital preservation community, developing good practice. And the NDSA Levels is a really good exemplar of how that happens, including going from version 1 to version 2. A thing that it was trying to do was, it's really hard. We know from doing more than 60 digital preservation management workshops now, it's really hard for organizations and individuals to get started. So the levels are a way of sort of laying out a map to say, this is how you might go ahead. So version 1 was specifically addressing that gap. And it's an iteration. So in software, it would probably still be a beta version almost because people had to try it. From my perspective, considering the digital preservation three-legged stool that we use, it's really about the technology leg. And initially, that did cause a bit of confusion for people because we had the 3 legs in place from our workshop series and the 5 stages to develop them. I got, at the time, when version 1 came out, a lot of questions about what is this? How does it relate to the stages? What's happening? It is really about some sort of like breadcrumbs for people to use to get going on the technology leg, not the whole of digital preservation. It really doesn't address things like policies and a lot of other decision-making activities, but it does get you going on the technology leg. It was also a way to frame the discussion for organizations, and it made it possible for people to have conversations with the people who approve funding and all different kinds of that. So the levels are intended to be general for all, but specific enough to set goals. So they're in gathering up feedback to put into doing levels version 2, it became clear that some people feel like it should be so specific that it suits them. We really push back against that, and you'll hear that from Dan. But it's a simple way for people to be able to demonstrate progress. All of the feedback that came out from people using version 1 and being very interested in version 2 fed into the iterative process we use to get to version 2. And now there's a process that will go ahead to get the next version going. That's the way that community practice has to work. So there's now starting to be some impact beyond the US. When we put together the IPRES 2019 workshop, for instance, we just kind of went with, because it got accepted, because people seem to be aware of it, that we could start from what's different between version 1 and version 2. And it became clear in that workshop that a lot of people really weren't familiar with version 1. So we've been trying to put in a lot of context. We've been trying to make it possible for people to see what was version 1, how do we get to version 2, and then we'll have a process for iterating and beyond. So it's really become a mature kind of community guidance project, which is great. Levels version 2, 2013 was a starting point. There was a sense that it was okay, there's not a lot of opportunities for preservation humor, but there was a sense that some people thought of it as a bingo card. There wasn't a clear path. You could sort of bounce around between parts of the cells and sort of say this, not that. So we tried to deal a lot with consistency, clarifications, updates, trying to move it along so that people could figure out how to apply it, how to make use of it, make sure that it's demonstrating the current version of good practice, think about how the broader community, how it can use it, how it can compare use. And you'll hear about different parts of the project, the whole effort. There were a number of working groups. Ours was specifically focused on the revision itself, and we had a lot of good conversations that led to the version 2, and Dan will be talking to you about that. The map forward to encourage common use. This is how do we make sure we keep up? How do we kind of map back to it so that we can have discussions across the community and across our organization? Dan.
Okay. And have I been given control of the slides? There we go. Okay, great. Hi, Dan Noonan. So a little bit of what Nancy said, there might be a little bit of a rehashing of what I have to say, because it kind of, the continuum of what we're doing here to explain what we did. I'm going to try and focus specifically on the revision task that we went through in our particular work group. That being said, is that if we look at the timeline here, that it took approximately a year and a half from the call of participants in early 2018 to debut version 2.0 this past fall, both at IPRES and at DigiPrez. Granted, this does not include the pre-planning that NDSA's coordinating committee put into this. Nevertheless, I see this as a pretty impressive feat from my experience in working in a variety of different national and international work groups over the past many years. As a matter of fact, the response was so voluminous that that's what ended up happening is we couldn't all do the one thing, which I think most people said, oh, I want to help, rebuild the matrix or figure out how to update the matrix. So it was split into a variety of these different work groups that we will be talking about this afternoon here. So in approaching the revision process, we wanted to make sure that we addressed all key technological topics, while at the same time making sure the matrix was simple and practical in regards to specific and immediate actions. One of the key things we all need to keep in mind is that the levels of digital preservation are meant to address the technological aspects of digital preservation, not necessarily things like digital preservation policy. Further, we are intentional in the use of the term technological versus technical. Technological meaning that is of or relating to technology, whereas technical means the use of terminology or treating subject matter in a peculiar or particular field. So it's really about the technology is what the matrix is trying to address, and the things that we're talking about are technological, not technical. We also wanted to stress an agnostic approach to the concepts used within the matrix that stresses a common practice and understanding and not based in a particular local practice or set of practices. Further, we strove to avoid details that would require revision in the near term. As an overarching strategy, we worked hard at bringing a sense of consistency across the functional areas and the levels. We entered this process with the expectation for much discussion, where folks actively listened, were considerate of one another while we're making decisions, and even if the decision was to move on and come back later to a particular aspect and to carry on. Sorry, I lost my slide control there for a moment. In 2013, the NDSA unveiled this version of the levels of digital preservation. The effort was spearheaded by Jefferson Bailey, Andrea Goethals, Meg Phillips, and Trevor Owens, along with their working group members Abby Grotke, Amy Kirchhoff, Chris Klein, Gene Mandelbaum, Sean Runs, Robin Rugeber, and Linda Tadich. The groundwork was initially laid for this effort through NDSA's Content Working Group, a working group that exists to this day. Meg Phillips noted in 2013 that the levels are, quote, a tiered set of recommendations on how organizations should begin to build or enhance their digital preservation activities. A work in progress, it is intended to be a relatively easy-to-use set of guidelines useful not only to those just beginning to think about preserving their digital assets, but also for institutions planning the next steps in enhancing their existing digital preservation systems and workflows, unquote. I would stress the use of a work in progress as it is intended that this matrix is not a static document. They even called it version 1. While it took 6 years to complete the first revision, it is our intent to make this a more routine review. The Levels of Digital Preservation Revision subgroup, for which I was Karen Cariani's co-chair, was charged with updating and adding to the current themes of version 1 as needed and included in the levels of digital preservation. The overarching objective was to make sure the actions identified in each cell of the matrix are practical, actionable, and scalable guidance, not only for those with fully implemented digital preservation programs, but also, and maybe even more importantly, for those just getting started. We started with regular phone call virtual meetings in late summer of 2018. In addition, we spun off some specific task groups that met between meetings to tackle various aspects of the work. We reviewed lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots amongst our team, with other work groups, and externally with a broader review of our work as well as with the key original authors. And in my 15 plus years that I've worked with groups like this, I don't know that I've come across one that was as continually committed with such a successful outcome. You know, as Nancy was saying before, this really, really was a great work group. It was a collaborative community effort. Some of the highlights in the process included a regular vocabulary check. We struggled and struggled and struggled and struggled over words at time and what they mean. And we ultimately added into our implementation documentation a set of working definitions. Even what to call that versus glossary versus definition was a whole discussion in and of itself. There was much discussion, ranking, consideration, and reconsideration regarding the metadata functional area. I don't know how many times we went to that row, that functional area, and came back to it, and walked away from it, and came back to it, until we finally got to the point where we felt we were comfortable with it. We relied on survey feedback before and during the process to help guide our decisions. We considered adding a documentation row as another functional area, but we ultimately decided that was out of the technological scope of the matrix. And we decided to provide an alternative view for interacting with the matrix that we'll demonstrate in a little bit. While we were not starting with a clean slate, we did struggle with where to start. Do we start with a column and row labels? Do we start with the content in a cell? Do we start with going down one column of getting the level itself, or do we go across the functional area? Ultimately, it was a little bit of back and forth. We did start with the labels, but then we backed off as we felt we needed to address the content within each of the cells to see how they align to the labels. This ultimately led to a realignment of the columns themselves, or the levels themselves. In version 1, the columns or the levels were known as protect, know, monitor, and repair your data. In version 2.0, we felt it was more important to know your data and your content before one was able to adequately protect it. Further, that from a preservation point of view, we want to be able to not only repair our data, but sustain our content. Therefore, the progression is now know, protect, monitor, and sustain your content. We struggled and discussed at length the actual purpose of each of the functional areas, and we feel we have adequately restructured them for simplicity as well as extensibility. Therefore, we made the following changes. Storage and geographic location is now simply just storage. File fixity and data integrity is now more fully encompassed within the notion of integrity. Information security was really about control of our content. And metadata, well, it's just metadata. No changes there. And file formats is more broadly conceptualized as content. I'm going to briefly walk through a revision process we went through using the functional area of storage and geographic location as an example. Obviously, we started with the 2013 version, as can be seen here. And while we had discussion of what to name and how to arrange the levels, by a couple of months in, we had only tentatively renamed level 4. We can see here a variety of changes made and proposed in this particular functional area. So there was a lot of work done back and forth about content. Some of the color coding here was based on taking out, putting in, adding new comments that we can't see that are off to the side here about some of the content that's there. As we fast forward nearly 2 months, we can see evidence of our beginning to modify what the levels 1 and 2 should represent in the digital preservation continuum. This is where we're beginning to think that maybe the notion of protecting and knowing your data is kind of mismatched in the actual levels here. But at this point, we haven't actually formally done that because at this point, we're still going through functional area by functional area. And even when we're done with the functional area, we're jumping back into a former functional area to make sure that everything within a particular level is kind of in alignment so there's not some great disparity between the progression and the notion of going from one level to the next so that it seems as a more seamless continuum in the revised version. And another 2 months down the road, we see additional editing to the verbiage within the functional area. And the following month, we've not only accepted most of the changes and cleaned up the document to actually make it readable, but we've made the swap of level 1 and level 2 here. Further, we've made a change throughout the document to refer to data as content. That was one of those ones that we talked data, we talked file format, what are we actually talking about here? And we felt strongly that the notion of it's the content we're trying to get to know, to protect, to be able to sustain. It's not just about data in and of itself. It could be software, it could be files, it could be operating, it could be a lot of different things. And so it's more broadly conceptualized this notion, it's this digital content that we're trying to preserve. And further, we made changes throughout the document data's content, at which point we reached out, and then at this point we reached out to the original authors for feedback, and eventually we reached out to the general digital preservation community for feedback on what we'd done at this point. By last August, we're almost there. The final changes that we were making at that point was that step through of renaming all of the functional areas in a more simplified manner. And here it is. This is level digital preservation version 2.0. And yes, I expect you all to be able to read this in detail. And hopefully you're chuckling, but not really. We will be providing links to the actual documents themselves. I should note that the color here in version 2.0 does have subtle meaning. When I put together a draft of our final version, I added color, as I'm apt to make things not only more visually appealing, but possibly accessible, acknowledging the fact that this may not benefit those that have physical limitations in discerning colors. I did want the colors to mean that there is progression from starting out to having a sustainable program, but didn't want it the glaring in your face, red is bad, green is good, and therefore the more subtle shadings. And apparently the work group agreed with me on this. So here we can see we have the 5 different functional areas of storage, integrity, control, metadata, and content, moving across levels of knowing your content, protecting your content, monitoring your content, and sustaining your content. Now, alternately, since it's now actually being built in a spreadsheet, we decided, well, what happens if we were to flip things around a little bit? Is there another way that we could look at this that might be meaningful to some other organizations? In this case, we see as an alternate view, the columns and the rows have been flipped. So now we could look, say, across a level of knowing your content and see what that means for storage, for integrity, for control, metadata, and content. Another way to actually even flip this further would be to, in a sense of thinking of a pyramid, working from a base to a pinnacle, is you could reorder that so that your level 1s at the bottom, level 4s are at top. Just a matter of how you as the user of this in interacting with this want to be able to use it so it's going to be a meaningful tool for you and your organization. So that's kind of a fast fly through several months worth of work with this great team that we had. And at this point, I do believe I will be turning it over to Carol, who will talk about some of the other work groups that we have.
Okay, I'm muting and unmuting myself. Everybody hear me? All right. Thanks, Dan. I'm Carol Kussman, and I am going to talk today about some of the other related work that was built around the newly updated levels matrix. So another thing, Dan and Nancy were on the revision subgroup, and I was one of the co-chairs for the assessment subgroup. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the assessment group and some of the other group work. So as a first step of the assessment subgroup, we were kind of charged with investigating the use and adaptations of the levels of digital preservation. We were doing this at the same time as some of those revisions were starting. So we were trying to understand how the original levels of digital preservation was being used and how people may want to use it in the future. Shared some feedback with the revisions group, and some of that information might have helped them with the revisions work. But one of the first things we did is we just did our own analysis of who do we know that's using the levels of preservation, who's talked about it at conferences, what's been published, and tried to get an idea of how it was being used. And so the graph on here is just kind of categorizing how the levels of preservation was being used in the past. So definitely found out it's being used in multiple ways. For example, it's actually used as part of an accreditation process in the UK. So that was something new that we learned. It's also used as assisting with assessing tools or other systems. The most common use was definitely for self-assessment, followed by teaching others about digital preservation. And so the report that we wrote about our exploration kind of documents those findings, as well as talking about how organizations were using the levels at different levels within their organization. Some were using it across their institution. Others were using it at a department level on one or more collections. Some were using it at the consortial level, and some were using it just within workshops as a teaching tool. So there were lots of different uses, and that those uses were being done at different levels within an organization. So as one of the main uses of the original levels was a self-assessment, the assessment subgroup wanted to provide a template for self-assessment for the version for levels of preservation, digital preservation version 2. So people didn't have to create their own self-assessment tool every single time a different organization wanted to do this. This template that was created has users choose if an action in each cell is being done, if it's currently being worked on, or if the action has not yet been started. And so what the assessment tool does is it creates kind of a heat map result. So you can see on the screen here, the green means the actions are completed, yellow means they're in progress, and red means it's not completed. This self-assessment template is definitely not the only way to do an assessment. It's just one option, but it's a way for people not to have to start from scratch. The link on the screen here goes directly to the self-assessment tool in the OSF sites for NDSA. So to use the template, if you go to the OSF site and download the Excel file on the assessment tool OSF page, this is what the template looks like prior to entering in any of the information. The purple column on the left provides you with those basic instructions on how to use the assessment tool. You just enter a 2, 1, or 0 in the columns labeled enter 0, 1, or 2. And then in doing that, you get the color-coded heat map. So this is one that has partially been entered. So you can see that the 2 turns the cells green, a 1 turns it yellow, and a 0 turns it red. And not dark, bright red, because we don't want to scare people off. So this tool is definitely using that conditional formatting to create that heat map type of result. And it provides that visual representation of what's being done. So you can see with the green what's being done. It can also help you understand what you might want to focus on next, whether it's something you want to complete or whether it's something you haven't started yet. And then keep in mind that most institutions and organizations will not necessarily complete each aspect of a functional area before completing some aspects under the next level. It is definitely more of a progression than it was before, but you're going to be starting some of these things possibly out of order a little bit. But this is a good tool to be able to see what you've started and what you might need to be working on next. So just as there's multiple ways to use the levels themselves, there's multiple ways that you could use this self-assessment tool. After you complete the assessment, you end up with that color-coded heat map that shows your areas of completion, things to be worked on. So you can use that heat map as that visual aid when discussing next step with stakeholders. Right? Some people, you could tell them, yep, we've started some things. That heat map is going to show them what it is that you've been working on. Using this tool, you may be able to help make decisions, right? You may be able to decide better what to focus your next steps on. You know, do you want to concentrate on a specific functional area next? Do you want to set a goal to increase the overall level in all categories and kind of start from left to right to kind of turn it more green? What you do is definitely up to you and your organization. This is just one way to do these types of assessments. One of the other things that we heard when creating this assessment tool was colors are great, but some people like numbers. Some people don't like numbers. To be able to assign a score to your levels of digital preservation, we chose to stay away from the score. There seem to be more negative feelings about assigning a number to this, but you may want to do that. Your stakeholders may want to have a number associated with a preservation score. How you do that is going to be up to you, but it is another way that you can think about an assessment. So the most important thing to think about possibly, though, is once you do this assessment, revisiting the self-assessment at a regular interval is going to be very useful so you can monitor your changes over time. So what is some other ongoing work and some work that those other subgroups have been doing? So the curatorial subgroup is another subgroup that was created early on during the levels of preservation updating. And the curatorial subgroup's been working with the updated levels document to kind of create a curatorial overlay that addresses other life cycle activities of digital materials. So before they started this work, they first had to define what curatorial means. And so they did this by reviewing existing curatorial mappings. And then they worked to determine how to create a broad configuration that could work with all kinds of archival management methods in the United States and abroad. And so in the end, what they came up with were 4 curatorial viewpoints, which is what you see on the screen here, kind of across collection development and collection management activities. So collection development itself includes appraisal and acquisition activities. And some of the collection management activities include security, intellectual access, and technical access. And it's hoped that the resource that they're creating can aid in being able to assess the capacity and readiness of a digital preservation program, a way to provide research and education about curatorial and technological issues surrounding the preservation of digital content. And it can provide a flexible way for curators to be able to assign kind of appraisal values to at whatever level is appropriate for the materials at hand. So what this might look like, this is kind of an example of what the curatorial layer might look like. And it's definitely not supposed to be linear, but it's designed to be useful at any point in the curation process. And so this is a sample workflow if we were starting with collection development, kind of from that collection development point of view. And this workflow is showing you where we would have decision points. So thinking about, do we want to include this in our collection? Well, is it unique? Yes or no? If yes, we go to the next question that says, does it conform to our collection development policy? Yes or no? If it does, then we have the digital preservation retention requirement sub-process, which is another process they're working on. And then moving over to that pink diamond, it says where to next. So if we've determined on a collection development side that, yes, this is an object we want to retain, we can then think about security side of things, the intellectual access side of things, or the technological access side of things. This is something that is in progress right now and hopefully will be out soon. And it's really just meant to be a high-level overview, kind of a first pass at these curatorial overlays. What we are hoping is that as we move forward, if there's any additional information that we need with those curatorial layers, the education, outreach, and advocacy activities that we hope to continue to do will start to address those. So the curatorial group itself is wrapping up, but we are continue to work as the Levels of Digital Preservation Working Group. And so you're interested in working on any of these things that are on the screen, please let us know and we can connect you with the right people. But these are some of our future activities that we are working on. So there's interest in exploring other uses or adaptations of the levels themselves. So that curatorial group is creating kind of that first step with the decision trees, but we might need some other additional resources to actually to answer some additional questions. We want to develop guides for how the levels could be used as a teaching tool, so individuals would not have to start from scratch. That was kind of our second most common use for the levels that we found. We would like to develop guides for how the levels could be used to help advocate for digital preservation resources. And then we would like the levels of preservation matrix to be translated into various languages. I believe that both German and Turkish are already in the works, or people are interested in doing that. If there's other languages that you would like to translate into, let us know. And then moving forward, we are also working on trying to see if there's going to be kind of another working group that can manage kind of the education outreach and advocacy group of this. But we're going to work towards also continuing promotion of the levels of preservation by working through presenting at conferences, webinars, poster sessions. And then, like I think both Dan and Nancy talked about, we want to develop a feedback loop for suggestions for future iterations of the levels and come up with a game plan of when and how do we update the levels so they stay more current, so we're not waiting 5 years for every revision. And so this is just a resources page for you. So we pulled together where you can find all of the information that we have been talking about. So just in general, if you want to know more about NDSA, the main website is provided here as the first link. The second link provides you direct access to the Levels of Digital Preservation webpage, which talks about, I think it still has our entire work plan up there, but links directly to the resources and some of those main activities that we've been doing. And then the Levels of Digital Preservation OSF site has all of our resources. So all of the final products can be found there. So you can find the matrix. There was another guide that was created with the matrix. Dan, I'm forgetting the name of it. Implementation guide for the levels of digital preservation, as well as the self-assessment tool and the report on how things are being, how the original levels were being used. So all of those can be found there. Here is a list of information of our names and emails. If anybody has questions after this, we're happy to help. Linda Paddock is also on this. She helps with this presentation as well, and was on the revision subgroup, I believe. And so I think we now have time for questions if anybody has any questions. I know that was a really quick run through of the levels there for you.
Okay. Nancy, Carol, and Dan, I know while we're waiting for questions to come in, you had some questions for attendees. Should we go ahead and do the poll while people are thinking of their questions, or did you want to do questions first and then the poll?
Sure, let's do the first poll question. The which most accurately, yep.
Okay, and that is showing up on the right-hand side of the screen. I'm going to read it just for the sake of the recording. Yep. And the question is, which most accurately describes your storage situation? You have to pick one. A, have 2 complete copies in separate locations. B, have 3 complete copies with at least 1 copy in a separate geographic location. C, have at least 1 copy in a geographic location with a different disaster threat than the other copies. And D, have at least 3 copies in geographic locations, each with a different disaster threat. And let's give folks a few minutes to answer.
So while people are answering that poll, Michelle is asking, when we mentioned that you'd like the levels of preservation to be updated more regularly, what is the goal timeline that you'd like to see? Dan and Nancy, I don't know if you have any other thoughts or comments, but the answer is more regularly, and I don't think we have come around to what that regularly means.
No, we haven't established any frequency yet. It just felt that, like, well, 5 years, that was kind of a long time. At the same time, it might also mean it's just a matter of, okay, is this still looking good? Does it really need revision? But it's kind of like taking care of it as opposed to just kind of letting it be out there, and then all of a sudden 10 years later you go, oh, didn't we have something out there we should have been thinking about? So I think it's that sense of a more regular review is to make sure we're staying on course, even though there might not be a course correction with that. I don't know, would you agree, Nance?
Absolutely. I also feel like we made a concerted effort to make it easier to update next time, and with the documentation and things that there would, the lessons learned and things like that we've been trying to share. I think it would be a process that would be much more able to go through in a quicker way. The first time came together rather organically, and this was a more constructed process that hopefully is repeatable in some way.
And also more transparent too.
Yeah.
Right. And I would say that there are various different activities that NDSA does on some semi-regular basis, and this would be one of those I think that could get into that queue of, okay, we're going to do the steward survey, we're going to do the web archiving survey, we're going to do that every couple of years. We're going to want to say, okay, let's spin up a little group that's going to take a look at this, and do we need to make any changes, or is life good right now? That kind of a thing. I would say is that one of the comments that that we had to address early on with this particular revision was the notion of access, and that's not represented in these levels of digital preservation. And once again, that really, to some respects, goes back to the notion that this is about the technological aspects of the content itself. And so we even toyed with, do we add a level for that? Concurrent to this, there was a group that organically spun up in the Digital Library Federation that actually is addressing this right now, and they actually have a draft document out that is to address the notion of access and preservation in regards to born digital access. So that's another thing that's out there in the community right now to be looked at.
Michelle.
Hey.
Oh, I was going to read the next question.
Go ahead. I was just going to read Michelle's question, but
okay. I was going to say,
how long did it take? How many months did it take to complete this revision? In other words, what commitment would you ask people to make if they, when and if they pledge to help revise it in the future?
Well, I would say we started the actual work itself. I think our first meeting was probably in the August of 2018, and we had wrapped up the revisions by August of 2019. So that was about a year. Now, once again, like I kind of alluded to earlier on, is that didn't take into account kind of the overall planning that came from NDSA itself. There was a bit of a longer tail than that to get us to that point. Whereas you could see is if, once again, if we routinize this and make it something that we do on a regular basis, that every couple of years there's a call for a core group to get together, we would expect them to maybe take 9 months to a year to kind of flesh it out and see if there's any substantive change. It might not take that long. Maybe we've got some of the big work out of the way by the work that we did this past time. Hard to say. I don't know what that would look like in the future. But I would say that, like with a lot of these kind of work groups that get spun up on these national, international things, is there usually is an expectation about a year's commitment.
I think a year would make sense. I also think we could do it in a more structured way because we went through the process in this way. Be like a 6 month sort of like, let's really look at the revision. And then the year would include the review time plus the rollout, whereas we had to add on a bit to the year to do those other things.
True.
I think it could be a tidier process next time.
Okay. Someone's just saying that they really appreciate the self-assessment tool because it provides clarity on how to use the levels of digital preservation. And we have a question from Veronica. On a macro level, do you have any thoughts on how different groups focused on digital preservation can coordinate their activities to minimize duplication of efforts? For instance, NDSA has the levels and COSA's SERI initiative has the SERP framework. How do we work together to highlight each other's work and make sure that people don't get burned out because they're working on multiple projects?
Looking at Carol, I see that comment there. I work on multiple projects with Carol, so I know what that means.
One of the things, this is Carol, one of the things that I would say is that we can't be afraid to talk to each other, and we can't be afraid to share. I think that's one of the things that I've run into a lot is, we're not ready to talk about it. I don't want to share with you, until it's kind of that final product. But if people are more willing to talk and share earlier on, I think would help kind of not duplicate efforts. And I think that kind of, the projects that you've listed too they have a slightly different focus. Kind of, Nancy was talking about, the teaching with the three-legged stool and how the levels are just focused on the technology leg. And so a lot of different projects kind of focus on different areas.
And I would say this is where we as these practitioners in these areas need to think about how do we more actively interlink to these other projects. Because what Carol was just saying is that as I approach the environmental scan I'm doing at my institution right now is I'm definitely using the levels as an assessment tool. At the same time, I'm using Nance's stuff, a three-legged stool, and the readiness stuff to kind of all combine together to give a better picture of where we are organizationally across the whole. Because keeping in mind the levels is only one aspect of what we have to do. So it's like the other project I was mentioning out of DLF, that as that comes to maturity is we need to know how do these things link into play and make sure that we're sharing the resources together.
I have a sense that the community, the good practice does kind of expect people to look around and start from a kind of like what's happening before moving forward. And I think that's happening more actually. I know I was involved with the SERI advanced class, and so hopefully the sort of framework is basing itself, builds on in some ways. But if it's applying for a community specific like to COSA, then there is like how you adapt these things. It's a bit like technology reuse or something like that. You're applying it to a situation, but building on things that exist like building blocks.
Okay. I think the poll results are up. I know I can see them just below the chat.
So this question was taken from one of the functional areas from the levels of preservation. And so it's talking about, I can't read anymore. Which area is this, Dan?
It's storage.
Storage.
Yeah.
So this, really we just kind of wanted to throw this poll question out here, is that it's kind of a simple, well-loaded question about how many copies you have and where you have them stored, that this is what the self-assessment tool does. Which one of these things fits your organization. So about half the people answered, and it looks like results are fairly even between A, B, and C. So having 2 complete copies, I can't read them, 2 complete copies in separate locations, and having
complete with at least 1 geographically dispersed, and having at least 1 copy in geographic location 3 and a different disaster threat, and then having the 3 copies. Now, I would say there should have been the 5th option here of not doing it. And that I'm wondering if that's what the no answers were, is they really were at below the having 2 complete copies.
Yes.
So, which is a valid answer.
Yes, it is.
I think a lot of people, including myself, I could not answer this question.
I think this is actually the first time we've ever done a poll during a SERI webinar, so it just may be lack of familiarity. And I just did see one comment. For at least some people, don't know might be the most accurate answer.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, because a lot of time in doing these self-assessments too, it's not just you, right? You're not going to have all of the answers. So it is another way to kind of get the right people in the room who can answer those questions.
The survey that we use for our workshop is in part built to create a development plan, because if you don't know, and a lot of people don't for all kinds of things, those are the things to start with. Find out.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Should we put up the second poll question now?
Sure. Just for fun.
Okay.
This one was also just asking about what was the last one?
This would be about content.
Yep.
Okay, and just for the sake of the recording, I'm just going to read it. What activities do you do to the content in your control? Check all that apply. A, document file formats and other essential content characteristics. B, verify file formats and other essential content characteristics. C, monitor for obsolescence and changes in technology. And D, perform actions such as migrations, normalizations, and or emulation to ensure content can be accessed. So this is a multiple choice.
You can check all that apply. Yep.
So yeah, that's a multiple response. That's what I meant to say.
Yep.
So we'll give folks a few minutes.
And this was just another example of if you were using the levels of digital preservation, kind of the questions, the content that you would see on that matrix.
Okay. Give folks a little additional time to answer that. In the meantime, if anyone has any other questions for our presenters, please feel free to enter them in the chat box. And while we're waiting, I don't have a question per se, but I just want to echo somebody else's comment earlier that I'm really pleased with this revision, and I'm particularly pleased with the assessment tool. I've used the Levels version 1 as a teaching tool many times, and tried to make people know that they're not playing digital preservation bingo. So I think this will be really helpful, and I think it's also will give people feeling like they're getting some credit for doing some things. For instance, there's one level 1 activity. I'm not going to go into details here, that for technical reasons my repository simply can't do. Mm-hmm. So I was in this strange situation of saying, well, we've got all of 3 and most of 4 covered, but there's this one item on level 1 that we're not taking care of. So does that mean we get a 0 for this particular column?
Yeah, and so thinking about things like that too, if anybody has suggestions on how the assessment tool can be modified for kind of those, outlying questions. And so we pulled it out where if there were multiple items in each functional area for level 1, that each one was individual. So you didn't have to do everything in that. You know what I mean? Like if there were, I can go back, I can find it in a bigger version. They're kind of blurry on here, so like under storage level 1, there were 3 things to do. Mm-hmm. So you would only get like not started for one of those versus you might have done these other 2.
Okay.
But whether maybe there's another category that it just stays white, where not possible or does not apply, could be added to this.
Great. I think everybody's had enough time to finish the poll. So can we go ahead and close that?
Sure.
See if we can get the results. Okay, still not seeing the results. Oh, there we go.
Hit the apply button.
Okay.
Even.
Yeah. More than half doing A, about a third doing B, and anywhere from 40 to 44% doing C and D, and well, 44% no answer. And I assume some of that is don't know, need to consult with a colleague.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is just, another example of kind of what you would see on the new levels grid. So yeah, thank you for participating.
Yes. Yes, I know that our April presenters are also interested in doing polls, so more polls will be coming. Okay, we've got just a couple minutes left. Any final questions?
And if people come up with questions later, please feel free to contact us. And if you're interested in doing any of these things, moving forward with the levels, let us know. So there's also generic emails on the NDSA website you can contact.
Okay.
I put in the chat a link to the DLS Born Digital Access Working Group, their levels of Born Digital Access. Their draft was out for review by December 15th, but the stuff is still there to kind of look at if you're interested in looking at that too.
They're meeting right now.
Yep.
I couldn't be there.
Okay, Dan, thank you for sharing that. In the absence of any other questions, it's 2:57 Eastern Time, so we're just going to bring this in for a landing. When you exit the webinar, you will automatically be taken to an online evaluation. Please take a couple of minutes to complete the survey. It really does help the SERI Education and Programming Subcommittee plan future webinars. These just don't go into the evaluations do not go into a digital black hole. We read them, we take them seriously. We've gotten suggestions about, letting people know the level of technical expertise they should have before they attend a given webinar. That's now a feature of our publicity materials. We pay attention to topics. If you know of anybody who would be a particularly good webinar presenter, feel free to pass on that information to us as well. In addition, we encourage you to stay connected and informed. COSA makes information about the SERI webinars and other SERI events, and of course other COSA events available via its website, via Twitter, Facebook, and we're posting videos to YouTube. So thank you all very much, and have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.